The iron bin heaved, bolts whining through rust, and the cage rose 3 paces before the chronicler snapped a recoil of paper into his ledger. Suspicion tightened the chronicler's hand as he watched a gaunt figure press a forehead to cold iron. The crowd leaned in, stilling like a shuttered market. A magistrate read names from a folded order, and the jailer set a gloved hand to the bolts. The conflict showed itself in clear, physical terms. A civic sentence turned into a public spectacle, and the chronicler had to decide whether to record or to interfere. The chronicler did not step forward. He stood at the fringe, ledger open, quill poised, eyes tracking the rope. He had arrived at dusk with the sound of hooves on cobbles ahead of him. He had been paid years before to make events permanent on paper. His voice in the square would be a list, a set of dates and marks. His hands would make the truth legible or leave it buried. He felt the pull of duty and the sharper tug of doubt. That doubt, suspicion about motive and fairness, shaped every line he wrote that night. Name. The magistrate's voice carried. Sentence set. Pierre Bennett, the magistrate read, guilty of theft and incitement. The jailer tightened a strap. He order stands. The chronicler wrote each word. He moved his pen with deliberate slashes, measuring the sentences by ink. He recorded the bolts the jailer counted aloud. He recorded the time a boy vomited at the square's edge. He recorded how the crowd hissed when the magistrate said the guild's name. The opening scene turned the crowd into evidence. A woman spat at the magistrate's boots. A pair of gardeners crossed themselves. A tradesman, who later would be called to testify, covered his face with a rag. The chronicler made small, exact marks for each gesture. Those marks were his pact with the future, and the only place someone might later point and say, "This happened." The jailer moved with the economy of someone who had rehearsed cruelty into habit. He worked the bolts without flourish. He checked rope knots, then checked them again. He kept his face fixed. When his eyes flicked, they avoided the man inside the cage. He kept back. "Jailer, I write," the chronicler answered. "Let me close." The jailer did not invite closeness. He backed chronicler. The chronicler stepped nearer anyway, and the jailer made a motion with his thumb across his throat. The chronicler felt the crowd's appetite and the town's architecture of shame. Scaffold, cage, ledgers, and a magistrate's seal. He felt the pressure to turn a social fault into a public lesson. He felt also the shape of a different pressure. Someone somewhere had marked this man with a token that did not fit a common thief. That token would not let him sleep. Inside the cage, the victim had thin, raw hands. He breathed with a noise like the last of a bell's toll. He the name of a saint in a voice that shook. He tugged at the bars in short, useless bursts, and his wrists bore the ragged marks of rope. When he mumbled, the chronicler leaned in and the jailer gloved his hand over his mouth. The jailer muttered, "Silence keeps order." The victim's mouth formed a single, humanizing detail, a small carved charm tucked in the rope. The chronicler saw it when the jailer flipped the bindings to a secure knot. It lay there, a worn miniature of a guild symbol. The chronicler's pen hesitated. His suspicion tightened into a question that needed an answer. He reached. He did not ask permission. He lifted the charm from the frayed rope and held it between 2 ink-stained fingers. He recognized the carving by the shape of cut marks he had traced years earlier when he catalogued guild seals. The charm belonged to the Cooper's Guild. That single object changed the ledger's weight. "Chronicler!" the jailer barked. "What are you doing?" "I am writing what is here," the chronicler. "I found this." The jailer stepped closer and the crowd stirred like a fish in shallow water. A woman called, "Is he a Cooper?" Another voice said, "Lock him higher." The magistrate's face remained blank. "We follow the order." Pierre Bennett worked at the coop, the chronicler out loud, to the magistrate and to the town and to his own ledger. "That is a Cooper's mark." The magistrate folded the order and his hand did not tremble. "Guilty is guilty," he said. "This council has decided." The chronicler felt the first shift of emotion. Suspicion gave way to a sharpened insistence. He could no longer treat the scene as merely bureaucratic. He had to seek the context of the charm. He wrote a line and then wrote another, adding the mark he had found on a previous page. He needed to tie this name to a registry and to a guild roll. He needed to test whether this sentence had been levied in error or in calculation. The jailer called a boy to hand a lantern, and then moved along the cage, tightening a bolt until metal sang. The victim coughed and whispered, "Please." The word was thin and the crowd heard it like wind through a gap. Some listeners turned away. The chronicler did not. He felt pity in the muscles of his jaw. He set down a small note. Carved charm, Cooper's mark, possible misapplied sentence. That note set a second emotional movement in him. Anger at the possibility of wrongdoing masked by civic procedure. The anger showed in the chronicler's rhythm. Faster strokes, shorter pauses, the occasional blot of ink where the quill bit the page. He read the magistrate's seal again. He memorized the time. A man pushed through the fringe. He wore a patched doublet and smelled of horse sweat. Pierre owes me for wood. The magistrate replied, then take it to the council. The man stamped his foot. Council gives the sentence now. The crowd murmured, and a woman spat again. The jailer tapped the cage with a gloved knuckle. The victim coughed more loudly and the sound turned several heads. The chronicler wrote the cough. He wrote the man who claimed a debt. He wrote the magistrate's refusal to move the sentence. Each written line was now an accusation in slow ink. At the cage bars, the chronicler leaned against cold iron and spoke to the jailer, quieter, who signed this. The jailer, one name and one name only. Captain Marchand. That answer created a third shift inside the chronicler, from anger to a cautious calculation about risk. Captain Marchand was a civic officer with reach. Opposing Marchand could cost the chronicler his ledger's access. He could be barred from archives. He could be threatened. He placed his hand on the quill and felt his pulse. He balanced the ledger's duty to truth against his own capacity to act. Marchand gives orders, the jailer repeated, we obey. The magistrate set a hand on the cage's frame and announced that the cage would remain for days. The crowd exhaled and a small cheer rose, then subsided. A drummer in the periphery rolled a short call. People began to drift away in bundles, gossip already forming. The chronicler stayed, refusing to let questions evaporate. Night closed. Candlelight cut into the square in hard shapes. The chronicler walked the perimeter and took the names of witnesses. He spoke to 2 merchants and a laundress. He spoke to the boy who had carried the lantern. Each person provided a small, concrete detail. When the magistrate read the order, who had been in the council chamber, whether Pierre had been taken without counsel, each detail fed the chronicler's ledger and tightened his resolve. In a narrow exchange near the lopsided well, the chronicler confronted the jailer in public. Jailer, why did Marchand put him up? The jailer answered, Marchand feared riot. He ordered an example. You call that justice? The chronicler. Chronicler, the jailer replied, I am not a judge. Then whose justice are you serving? The chronicler. The jailer did not answer that aloud. He tightened the bolts on a lower hinge and met the chronicler's gaze only briefly. When he spoke, it was a statement of duty. Order, that's all. The crowd's reaction split. Some participants nodded at the magistrate, others ducked away, unable to watch. The victim shifted his weight against iron and began to weakly sing a prayer. A raven settled on a nearby post and pecked at a broken crust. The chronicler recorded each motion. He felt an internal shift again, from calculation back to a steadier, colder resolve to document fully and then to test the order. He would not be a passive clerk. He made a private vow with the ink, follow Marchand's chain of command and trace the Cooper's charm. When he bent to copy the municipal mark from a scrap of paper someone had dropped, a hand touched his shoulder. It was the Cooper himself, a broad-shouldered man who later would give testimony, named Etienne. Chronicler Etienne, you saw that token. I did. Etienne's voice lowered. Pierre is my brother's apprentice. The chronicler's pen paused. He wrote Etienne's name beside the charm. Why would the magistrate call this theft? Etienne pinched the bridge of his nose. Marchand wants to starve a guild that refused his levy. That statement introduced a concrete political motive and created a twist. The punishment might serve as intimidation against the Cooper's guild. The chronicler's ledger gained a new column. Political pressure as motive, he felt the town shift underfoot. What had appeared as punishment now smelled of coercion. Arguments began. The magistrate announced that investigations would not delay the sentence. Etienne cursed the magistrate's name. The jailer obeyed. The chronicler recorded each short exchange in a rapid burst of dialogue. The jailer and Etienne clashed. Etienne, stand down, the jailer. Jailer, look at him! Etienne replied. Etienne, mind your place. The jailer, are you a man or a tool? Etienne demanded. That exchange lasted little more than a minute. It contained 5 short lines and moved the square from murmurs to anger. The chronicler wrote them verbatim. After midnight, the magistrate left with 2 torchbearers. The crowd thinned. The jailer secured the cage and then tightened a rope that held the victim's bindings. The victim pressed a face into his knees and wept quietly. The chronicler wiped ink from his fingertips onto his robe and copied the magistrate's seal into the ledger. He placed the carved charm in a small pouch and slid it beneath his cloak. He did not announce the theft. He now held a piece of evidence the council had not inventoried. Alone in a narrow alley, the chronicler compared his notes against the civic rolls he could access that night. He cross-referenced the cooper's mark with names and found one ledger entry that matched the charm. He found another entry that recorded a recently imposed levy on the Cooper's Guild. He placed the facts side by side with the magistrate's order. The suspicion that had opened the night had become a working theory. Marchand used exposure to cow a guild. The chronicler slept little. He wrote a long paragraph and then tore it out. He rehearsed how to present his findings without endangering his access to archives. He knew that exposure was not merely physical for this town. Exposure meant ruin. He also knew that the jailer would return at dawn and tighten the bolts again. He had to decide what he would do with the charm and with the names he now possessed. That decision tugged him between caution and duty. At first light, the victim hung listless. The jailer walked the square and inspected the crowd. Etienne returned with 2 other coopers and delivered a short, staccato argument with the magistrate's clerk. The chronicler moved through them with his ledger. He recorded Etienne's plea to the clerk and the clerk's curt dismissal. Every exchange added heft to the chronicler's ledger. Every recorded line made the possibility of injustice harder to ignore. When the chronicler finally chose to act, he did not march to the council. He placed a copy of his ledger, with the charm's imprint traced, in a narrow hollow beneath a stone near the well. He left a scrap folded into the pocket of a baker who had a cousin working in Marchand's office. He spoke only to Etienne and to the boy who had carried the lantern. Each contact was a measured attempt to seed the truth without forcing ahead on collision with authority. The chapter's climax had been the public confrontation at the iron bars, where the jailer tightened bolts to silence scrutiny and the chronicler's demand bumped into civic force. The immediate standoff ended with the crowd quieted and the victim slipping into stupor. The chapter resolves its mini-conflict. The chronicler secures partial evidence and vows to pursue Marchand's chain instead of letting the cage's story dissolve into gossip. Before the chronicler left the square, he looked once more into the cage. The victim's hands were slack. The chronicler pressed the charm into his palm through the bars and said, "Etienne will remember you." The victim's fingers closed briefly around the wood and then relaxed. The chronicler heard a final cough and wrote the time. He closed his ledger and tucked the quill behind his ear. He did not declare victory. He did not promise revenge. He left with a ledger heavier with names and a plan to follow the orders that had placed a man in a cage. The final image of the chapter is concrete. The chronicler stepping into a narrow alley, the carved charm in his pouch, the sound of a distant bell marking the hour, and the jailer walking back toward the square with keys clanking. Those sounds anchored the ending to a clear event, the chronicler's decision to pursue the chain of authority that authorized exposure. Some punishments quiet a square. This one left questions pinned to a ledger. The jailer slammed the cage lid. Iron protested with a high, raw scream as the magistrate's messenger read the order to extend the sentence. Suspicion lived in the chronicler's throat like cold ink. He stepped forward, fingers already stained, to record the command before the town could turn the moment into spectacle. The central problem landed in that instant. The sentence would stretch the victim's exposure by days, and nothing in the messenger's document explained why. The chronicler watched the jailer tighten the bolts and heard the man's hands pause at the same motion where the chronicler felt doubt begin to gnaw. Suspicion shaped the chronicler's actions. He kept his ledger open, quill poised, and did not move to the crowd. He had learned to watch first, to write what he saw and let others provide reasons. The chronicler's chest tightened when the victim's shoulders bucked against the bars. A hatch whispered shut, and the rope knotted at the jailer's hip. He recorded measurements, time, wind, The body's weight against iron, because facts might survive when memory did not. The jailer did not look at the chronicler. He wet his lips and said, "Names, sir." The messenger dictated names with the flat voice of duty. "One more day." "Count on it." The chronicler's hand trembled as he set the quill down, not to write but to press the ledger's edge flat. He could feel an emotion shift under his restraint. Suspicion became a tentative doubt about obedience. Had the magistrate extended this sentence for civic deterrence, or for something else? The victim's face was visible between bars, nose raw from cold, eyes fixed on the messenger as if the words could change flesh. The chronicler watched a thin line form around the man's mouth. He noted the rope mark on the neck and the fresh abrasion at the wrist. When a child in the crowd blurted, "Mercy!" the jailer answered without turning, "Our orders stand." The chronicler wrote the reply into the ledger, then wrote the child's shout on the opposite page as a timestamp. The scene demanded other names. The merchant's wife arrived 10 minutes later, hands grimy from the stall, voice high with grief. "Jailer!" she said, "Let him down. He was only stealing bread." She jabbed a finger toward the cage. "Let him down, John!" The jailer, John, kept working the bolts with a slow rhythm. "No," he said. The magistrate wrote the order. "I hold the keys." The chronicler watched this exchange, because the change that tugged at him now was not only doubt but a tightening anger at an office that coldly expanded harm. The merchant's wife turned her pleading to the chronicler. "Chronicler," she called, "write how long? Write mercy into his record." Her voice aimed at him as if he might translate pity into law. He felt the second emotion shift then, doubt sliding into moral agitation. His fingers hovered over the quill, then found the ledger again, not to comply but to preserve the facts of the plea. He wrote the woman's name, noted the way her knuckles whitened, and recorded John's silence. By late morning the lane filled with low voices. A few townsfolk wanted spectacle. More wanted assurance that the magistrate's penalties would keep them safe. The chronicler crossed to the threshold of a tobacco-stained house to take a witness statement. A man named Aldo, who had watched the previous victim die beneath the cage. He watched birds pluck at the fingers. Aldo, he did not cry out much at the end. Aldo's nails carried suit. The magistrate said it was for order. "I say it was for land." "Land." The chronicler. Aldo spat in the dirt. "Yes." The condemned held a parcel that went, after his sentence, to a neighbor. The magistrate signed the papers 2 days later. "You remember the bin that heved the first time?" he said. "It rose 3 paces and the crowd called it justice. Afterwards the ground carried a new fence and a new sign." The chronicler answered with a short note. He had seen the cage rise before. The first time he had snapped a recoil of paper into his ledger and felt his hand go cold. He was reluctant to call the thought conspiracy. Yet the ledger was where suspicions took distinct shape. The chronicler's reaction remained action-driven. He did not sit and fold feelings into metaphors. He went to the jailer and asked, plainly, "John, when did the magistrate sign the land papers?" John tightened his jaw. "Not my business, chronicler. I follow orders." He tapped the keys on his belt. The chronicler watched the movement, the habitual gesture of someone who wanted distance between duty and question, and logged it. The question hung like a coin in the air. When it fell, it exposed the coldness beneath routine. Afternoon brought a climb. The jailer and his apprentice mounted the scaffold to inspect the cage. The chronicler followed, ledger under arm. They found bars gnawed at the base and one shackle snapped through. "Where? We can mend it," the apprentice said, voice thin with worry. "Or we can leave it. Let it finish him fast." The jailer put a hand on the apprentice's shoulder and did not answer. He checked the bolts, turning them with a practiced twist. The chronicler recorded the choices: repair to prolong spectacle, neglect to quicken an end. The move exposed a third emotion shift. Agitation curdled into a focused calculation about consequence. On the scaffold, the jailer let his fingers drift over the snapped shackle, then reached into his pouch for a tightening tool. We fix it. We keep it as is." The apprentice swallowed. "Fix it quick, then." "I do not like to watch them suffer." The chronicler watched the apprentice's hand tremble as he held the hammer. The jailer forced the apprentice's hand steady and drove a new pin. The chronicler wrote the sound of metal meeting metal as if the noise were witness. The day leaned toward late afternoon when a delegation arrived at the magistrate's hall. A bereaved relative, a woman with a dark scarf, spoke to the magistrate and demanded clemency. The magistrate sat with his fingers laced, voice dry. "This is civic warning," he said. "The town keeps order because we demonstrate cost." The chronicler stood at the doorway. "Quill ready, civic warning for whose cost?" he asked aloud. The magistrate's eyes flicked to the ledger at the chronicler's hip. "For the town's cost," he answered. "Order must be visible." The bereaved relative stepped forward. "Order does not need our blood, magistrate." "Let him go." The magistrate named the condemned only as property and gave a reason that sounded less like law and more like preservation of his office. The chronicler felt anger sharpen in his chest. He did not shout the word, but let it show in the way he wrote the magistrate's phrase word by word. Back at his cramped chamber at dusk, the chronicler lit a candle and opened a folio he had seldom used. He did not plan mischief, he planned honesty. He thumbed through an older ledger and found an entry he had not expected. A record of a seized parcel of land tied to the condemned's name, dated 2 days after the corpse had been removed from the cage. The ink was the magistrate's, trimmed with a clerk's seal. The chronicler read the lines twice, then wrote them in his own hand as if the act of copying might make the fact less terrible. He carried the folio across the street to the jailer. "John," he said, laying the page on the table, "read this. This says the condemned's land was assigned the morning after the exposure ended." The jailer frowned, gaze settling on the seal. He tapped the iron keys at his belt with the back of his knuckles. "I do not decide who gains land, John. I chain the law to its edges." The chronicler saw a moral pressure arrive in the jailer then, the man negotiating duty against a human face that did not match the documents. The chronicler's doubt hardened into near certainty that the exposure functioned as transfer. At dusk the square swelled, voices braided into demands and curses. Carrion birds, practical and hungry, descended and circled above the cage like black punctuation. The victim inside shouted once, a raw sound, and then reached for the bars in a frantic sweep. Someone in the crowd said, "Look at him!" And the jailer stepped closer, hands quick at the bolts. The magistrate's guard pushed through the people, faces set, and a magistrate's aide barked an order. The chronicler felt the chapter's peak arrive. His hands went cold, but his writing did not falter. The jailer hesitated. He could tighten the bolts and let the night take its prescribed course, or he could cut the rope and risk the magistrate's wrath and his own reputation. For the first time, the chronicler saw John's mouth move with a private argument. A small line of wavering. "John!" shouted the magistrate's guard. "Do your duty!" John began. A short exchange followed, quick as clattering tin. "John, you will not cut loose." The guard said. "John, you will not be lenient," the magistrate's aide said. The merchant's wife yelled, "John!" The jailer looked at the victim's face and then at the keys. He drew a breath and moved his hand toward the rope. That motion became the mid-chapter cliffhanger. The chronicler stopped writing for a single heartbeat and watched the jailer's fingers make contact with the knife. For a moment nothing else existed but the scrape of leather and the distant flapping of wings. A child sobbed. The jailer's hand trembled, then he lowered the knife without cutting. The guard stepped in and seized his shoulder. The chronicler wrote the motion in 3 quick notes. Hand, knife, seizure. The guard's grip turned the jailer away. They yanked him backward by the belt. The magistrate's guard then forced the rope loose or dragged the cage down by force. The chronicler did not see the exact mechanics from where he stood, only the result. A brutal administrative motion that finalized the victim's fate. The crowd fell quiet as if the moment had swallowed sound. The chronicler recorded the final act with a hand that betrayed revulsion. He wrote times, the names of those who intervened, the sounds he could not unhear. Nightfall carried the victim's body away on a cart without ceremony. The jailer stood with his head bowed, keys at his side like a commodity he could not sell. The apprentice cleaned his hammer so that the metal glinted under the torchlight. His movements were small and practical. The magistrate returned to his hall with a face set like a coin. The chronicler watched all of it and felt one last emotion shift, from focused calculation into a cold resignation that the town would accept the answer given by its authorities. Late at his desk by candlelight, the chronicler wrote the final motion into the ledger. He described the guard's drag, John's hesitation, and the magistrate's seal that had converted body into property. He used only the facts he had gathered. Times, words, names, the folio entry that tied land transfer to the exposure. He did not moralize. He noted the town's whispers and the way the merchant's wife's fists clenched into the night air. He closed the ledger with a burnished snap and pushed the folio with the seized parcel entry beneath his writing table. Outside, someone walked by and hissed a line about contracts. A window slammed. The chronicler listened and then set the ledger in the shelf where records of sentences lived. He paused, fingers wiping ink across the margin, and then, to finish the chapter's small resolution, he copied the magistrate's signature on a separate slip and tucked it into the folio as a witness to the transaction. He had no illusion that a signature would stop the rot. He had only the discipline to record it. He left the candle burning and walked to the window. From there he could see the scaffold where the cage had hung empty. Birds picked at a scrap caught in the slats. He could see the jailer standing by the gate speaking in low tones with the apprentice, voice rough. He put his hand on the windowsill and felt the wood's indent where his palm had rested years before when he first started to write public pain into ledger form. Memory arrived as concrete detail, the day the cage first rose and how the crowd had leaned in. He remembered snapping a recoil of paper into his ledger as the iron rose 3 paces. It had been the first time suspicion had put words on the page. He closed the window and relit his quill. He wrote the final line for the night's entry. The magistrate's order extended, the repair performed, the cart that took the body away, and the folio that recorded land reassignment. He wrote who had interfered and who had not. Outside, someone knocked on the magistrate's hall door. That knock echoed in the chronicler's chamber, and in the ledger as a new event, a small, concrete beat that promised further motion. He noted the knock in the margin and stopped. The chapter ends with that knock and with a choice recorded. The jailer had hesitated and not cut the rope. The guard had enforced the law. The magistrate had preserved his office. The chronicler closed his ledger for the night and pushed the folio further under his desk, where the paper could wait until the next dawn demanded its witness. The last sound in the room was the candle guttering and a distant, steady sound of boots receding, an action that anchored the chapter's resolution in a specific, physical movement rather than a romantic verdict. A crow tore at a wrist while the cage tilted and water flashed beneath. The chronicler flinched, set his quill, and wrote the angle of the fall. Suspicion tightened his fingers around the quill. He had felt that tightness since the cage first rose in the market and again when the lid slammed shut at the magistrate's order. The central problem lay bare between iron and river. Someone had weaponized exposure, and now the town argued whether the exposed would be left to die or spared. He did not speak the word betrayal yet. He recorded bolt tensions, rope strands, names. The river smelled of silt and iron, and the victim inside pressed a forehead to cold bars while the jailer knelt at the mechanism below. The chronicler had come to the bridge with ledger tucked under arm, because orders moved faster than conscience in that town. He remembered the iron bin heaved in the market, and the bolts winding through rust from weeks before. The earlier hoisting remained in his handwriting, the sentence inked across a margin. He had watched the first crowd lean in like shutters closing, and had noted the magistrate's messenger reading an extension order that kept the cage high and public. He had left a small inked suspicion in that margin then, and that suspicion guided every step he now took. He moved along the river parapet, boots finding wet stone, and checked the rope where it looped over the bridge beam. The strands were furred with damp fibers. A loose cord had begun to fray into threads that would not hold long. He touched the rope with 2 stained fingers, then drew back. He did not call out. He recorded the failing fibers in shorthand and folded his hands around the ledger until the messenger arrived with parchment creased and breath caught. A woman in the crowd spat and raised a wager longer, she said, let them learn. The jailer tightened bolts until metal sang. He did not meet the woman's eyes. The chronicler watched the jailer's hands, collused, methodical, and registered hesitation there. An essential crack in a mechanism built to look certain. Bring the order. The magistrate's messenger announced, breath rough from the run. He handed the folded parchment to a clerk, who presented it to the magistrate standing under the bridge arch. The clerk straightened as the magistrate read aloud, "By decree, exposure is maintained until further counsel." He paused before the last words as if weighing a phrase against a purse. The chronicler stepped forward and put the ledger on his knee. He flipped to the margin where he had earlier scrawled a note and found an extra annotation added in a different hand. Merchant X, payment recorded. Spectacle requested. The ink was darker than the rain recent. He considered how to show it without inflaming the crowd. Suspicion hardened into something close to resolve. He closed the ledger slightly and tapped the page so the magistrate would look. Magistrate, the chronicler, lowering his voice, though the bridge thrummed with murmurs. "You have a note here." You read it aloud. His voice did not waver in tone, only in the way he cleaned his fingertips on his robe between words. The magistrate's face contracted. "Chronicler, this is not your place. Records are private until sealed by the council." He tapped his wrist where a signet would rest in private chambers. "This is a public sentence." The chronicler answered. "If the council has traded justice for coin, the town must know." He snapped the ledger closed and revealed the darker ink as proof. The crowd shifted. The jailer looked up, and for the first time his jaw unclenched. The messenger red-faced, swallowed. "You slander the magistrate. He said you brought his order to this bridge. Did you not?" The chronicler, "You read it aloud in front of witnesses." "Read what?" "Paid for the spectacle." He pushed the page toward the magistrate so the writing showed. The magistrate took the paper like a blade and glanced at the margin. "This is a forgery," the magistrate said quickly. "A clerk's error." "Guards, confirm the ledger's seal." The magistrate's tone sought distance. He spoke like a man arranging candles to hide smoke. 3 men stepped forward, one of them a guard who had earlier helped hoist the cage. "The seal's intact, magistrate," the guard said. "But who wrote the note?" He looked at the clerk, who shook his head. Tension rose. The town's appetite shifted from curiosity to hunger. Someone tossed a wager at the victim's suffering. Others pressed into nearer silence. The jailer tightened a bolt with both hands and breathed out, a small sound that the chronicler caught as an admission of strain. Emotion moved in the crowd, suspicion to anger, anger to appetite, and then to a rough collective demand. A trader in the front shouted, "Cut it!" "Let the river decide." The cry split the air, and the jailer looked at the magistrate for answer. The magistrate's mouth thinned. He saw a pledge to uphold law, but his hand brushed a purse at his belt. The chronicler's suspicion rearranged into a hypothesis. That exposure here had become currency for men with coin and influence. The chronicler turned a page. In older ink he had a list of names, those who had petitioned for spectacle in prior seasons. Merchant X appeared twice with a note about a dock dispute. He ran his finger down those names and then looked at the victim in the cage. An anonymous body, gaunt, chin pressed to iron, eyes sunken but not gone. The victim's lips shaped a prayer or a curse. The chronicler could not tell. The victim's hands, bruised at the wrists, dug at the bars and then fell slack. The chronicler recorded the motion. Tug, brief flurry, rest. A messenger from the magistrate's household pushed through the crowd and called, "By order of the magistrate. Any attempt to interfere will be punished." His voice had the brittle ring of someone reading words he did not trust. The jailer tightened bolts once more, then backed away with hands that trembled on the leather of his belt. The chronicler watched the jailer closely. He had seen that man tighten bolts in Chapter 1. He had seen the jailer avert his eyes from faces pressed to the iron. Now the jailer held the mechanical key near the rope pulley and looked up as a black bird landed on the cage's rim. The bird cocked its head and pecked at a finger. The jailer stepped forward and shoved it off with a gloved hand. He breathed like a man deciding whether to follow a hand he had been taught to obey. Up on the parapet, the crowd's mood hardened. Men with wagers exchanged coins and nods. A woman muttered a prayer for fevered sleep. A boy dropped a stone that plinked against the iron. The sound made the victim's head jerk. The chronicler wrote the stone's fall because small events shifted larger ones. A stone, a bird, a fraying rope. He marked time with his quill, counting the beats between one action and the next. At the bridge approach, the chronicler discovered a new presence. A second ledger tucked under the magistrate's clerk arm. He for it and the clerk offered it with shaking hands. The second ledger contained receipts, silver, wine, a notation tied to a dock merchant. The chronicler read one line aloud so the crowd could hear. Paid to secure spectacle, ledger entry 3rd day, merchant sellers. A murmur ran like wind through straw. The magistrate stepped forward. Stop this, chronicler. You spread discord. You accuse without proof. His voice tried for authority but landed on something brittle. I will not speak without proof. The chronicler, I will speak with proof. Read this passage and tell the town it was not written. He held the second ledger open. The clerk's hand covered the page as if to hide it. The guard behind the magistrate put a heavy palm on the clerk's shoulder. The first external event in this cluster happened when a merchant in the crowd shoved forward and grabbed the clerk's wrist. You lie for coin. He snarled. You make our justice into a show and take our silver, the clerk yelped. The guard moved to pry the merchant back, and the jailer stepped between them and the cage. Short, sharp dialogue traded like blows. Magistrate, the chronicler, do you deny the receipts? I deny these claims, the magistrate answered. They are forged. The clerk signed them, the guard said. I saw his hand. I did not sign for spectacle, the clerk insisted. Voice breaking, I signed for repairs, repairs, the merchant scoffed. Repairs do not pay for birds to peck a man alive, the back and forth stretched and snapped. 3 to 5 lines traded quickly, each name used so listeners could follow who spoke. Emotion shifted in the jailer. He had been implacable. Now he hesitated. His hands, which habitually tightened bolts, trembled when he touched the rope. He had believed in order as a shield against chaos. In the ledger's new ink he saw order used as shameless theater. The chronicler noticed the hesitation and wrote, because hesitation could be turned into evidence or excuse. A child in the crowd pointed at the cage and asked aloud, why is he up there? An old woman answered before the magistrate did, because we were meant to watch. Her voice had a flat acceptance that the chronicler logged as social sanction. The crowd's appetite for spectacle was not only a product of a few men but of a habit cultivated by the many. The chronicler stepped forward and addressed the jailer directly. Jailer, what holds the rope? Show me the knot. He spoke the man's title and name often to anchor the listener. Jailer, show me the knot. The jailer, broad-shouldered and weathered, removed a glove and showed the rope and the knot. His fingers brushed a frayed fiber and he drew his hand back. Stung, the rope is old. The jailer said low and even, it was meant for short display, not days. The counsel extended this until the magistrate's order. I obey. His voice had the steady cadence of someone who had repeated the same justification many times, who you to extend it. The chronicler, the messenger read the order here this morning, the jailer said. I followed the paper. I am not the magistrate. He looked at his hands. I do my duty. The chronicler recorded the precise phrase. I do my duty. He had written it earlier in other margins and saw it now as a refrain that masked decision. A rain cloud slid over the bridge rim and spit fine motes onto the iron. The victim coughed. The chronicler's quill darted across paper. He turned to the passage he had found earlier, a single marginal note added by a clerk in a different hand, and read it aloud so the magistrate could not deny the town's hearing. Merchant X paid to encourage public order. The phrase made a man in the crowd laugh a hollow laugh, and the magistrate's face went colorless. A new external event. A voice cried out from the far end of the bridge, rope. The rope is unraveling. The cry scattered the crowd into close, quick motions. People shoved forward, some to help, some to watch. The jailer made a movement toward the pulley and then checked himself. He looked at the magistrate, and the magistrate looked at his stuffed purse, and then at the quivering rope. The chronicler moved to the cage's base and put his hand on the iron. The metal was cold and slight rain slicked the bars. Inside the cage, the victim's breath came in rattled pulls. The chronicler set the ledger on a damp stone and opened to a page margin where he intended to write the sequence of events that would decide fate. He wrote the word suspicion, again, briefly, then crossed to a note about merchant sex entries. The magistrate's voice rose louder and less assured. Do not act on rumor. Let the council review. He raised his hand as if invoking law could still be effective when a rope frayed in front of him. The crowd answered with a collective hiss. A coin clinked and someone shouted for spectacle. The jailer swallowed the word spectacle like smoke. Tension crested into noise. The jailer walked the rim of the bridge with boot heels grinding stone. He knelt at the pulley, fingers testing the strands. A bird landed on the rim and batted at the dangling fabric of the victim's sleeve. The victim, thin to the point of bone, reached a hand through the bars and tried to cover the wound where the crow had pulled skin. He looked at the jailer and said, in a voice that broke between words, a please. It was a single word that held every plea and every bargaining point. The jailer paused. The air around him did not thicken with sentiment. Instead, his shoulders tightened, and he worked the bolt with both hands. He had two choices in front of dozens of witnesses, and a ledger heavier than any one man's conscience. The chronicler stepped closer and said, quiet, jailer, hear what the ledger shows. A merchant paid. This is not justice. The chronicler used the jailer's name repeatedly now. Jailer, choose. He did not press moral labels. He pressed facts. A quick exchange started between the chronicler and the magistrate, a sharp thread of phrases that moved like small stones down a steep slope. Magistrate, did you accept silver? The chronicler, I accepted payments for repairs. The magistrate answered, repairs do not mean longer sentences. The chronicler, who decided the extension, magistrate. The chronicler demanded, I issued an order for time. The magistrate said, time. The chronicler repeated, tapping the ledger. The guard interjected. He read the order aloud here. The magistrate insisted, then read the next line. The exchange was short and forceful, 3 to 6 lines. Names repeated so listeners could map who spoke. An unexpected reveal came when the clerk paled and confessed, I signed for spectacle to settle a debt at the docks. Merchant X threatened my family. The admission changed, framing like a hand moving tokens on a board. What had looked like municipal will now showed personal coercion. The chronicler registered the clerk's confession and wrote it in exact phrases. Signed to settle debt, merchant threat. The emotion shifted in the crowd again. Suspicion to righteous anger, then toward a numb silence that weighed on faces. The magistrate's hands found the purse at his belt and tightened. The jailer looked away from the magistrate and down at the rope. The clerk's shoulders hunched as if a weight had been lifted, and then replaced by fear. The cliffhanger arrived when the rope gave a small, sharp sound, the kind that precedes collapse. The crowd drew breath as one. Someone launched a curse. The jailer stepped to the pulley and seized the frayed end. For a breath the whole town watched whether he would secure it, replace it, or end it. A child cried, "Don't let him drown!" And the voice carried thin and unignorable. The jailer worked his palm along the strand and then looked directly at the magistrate and said, "This rope cannot hold another hour. We can replace it and lower the cage to the quay, or we can let the sentence end. What is your command?" He spoke to the magistrate with a bluntness that left no room for evasive law. The magistrate hesitated and then spoke the authority he hoped would quiet the crowd. "Extend until council meets." No change. He gave the order like one who counts on indifference to carry him through. The jailer looked at the masonry of the bridge, at his own hands, and then at the victim in the cage. There was a silence in the crowd like a held breath. The jailer lifted the heavy iron cutter he kept for emergency release and set it against the frayed rope. For a moment the entire chapter hung on his shoulders. The jailer raised the cutter and his knuckles whitened. He looked at the chronicler, then at the magistrate's purse, then at the victim's eyes. Nothing. The chronicler watched the man choose with ink in his fingers and recorded the exact movement of jaw and shoulder. Tighten, loosen, steady. Suspicion had become accusation and now confronted action. He cut. The cutter dropped through the strands with a single, decisive sound. The rope parted. The cage lurched, weight shifting as metal screamed, and the victim screamed inside in a noise that tore the air. The magistrate's guards surged forward and 2 men grabbed at the cage as it fell. The crowd answered that motion with a push, some toward the river and some away, and a man tripped and struck his head on a stone. The bird that had been on the rim flew off with a scrap of the victim's sleeve. The chronicler fell to his knees at the water's edge and wrote while men shouted and guards argued. He recorded the cut, the weight of the fall, the guard's hands on iron. He wrote the victim's name if any witness offered it. No one did. He wrote the magistrate's face as a catalogue of small betrayals. Fingers that toyed with coin while other hands held the city's life. At the water's edge the cage struck the river and rocked. It did not immediately sink. It bobbed, dragging water into its iron ribs. A guard dove and tried to wedge a pole through a rung. Another grabbed a rope to prevent it from slipping. The victim's hand found a bar and pressed. He coughed and the water rose the cage's rim a breath. The jailer had expected a simple end. Instead he found a chaotic scramble for salvage. The magistrate barked orders that split the air. "Stand back! Pull the cage! Save the ledger!" He barked for the ledger in a way that sounded less like saving truth and more like controlling it. The chronicler felt hands at his shoulder, two guards arguing about seizing his pages. "Hands off the ledger," he said, voice low but firm. "This is evidence." A guard named Rollo pushed back and said the magistrate had jurisdiction. The chronicler put his hand between Rollo and the ledger and said the ledger belonged to the town's record, not to any purse. After a tense grapple, the guards abandoned forcing the chronicler, because the ledger had already been exposed to so many eyes. They instead argued about the practical act of rescue. Men tied ropes to a cart and hauled at the iron. The jailer, with hands stained by rope fibers and bird blood, pulled until his shoulders burned. The victim coughed and tried to speak. He measured and small, "Jailer," and the jailer answered without pomp. "Hold on." The pair of words, said twice, anchored the chapter's human scale. A plea and a response, the cage scraped wet stones and finally gave way to human force. They hauled it up the bank and set it on damp earth like a thing that had been labored for and found wanting. The victim lay panting under iron, stunned but breathing. Men checked for broken limbs. A guard found only shredded cloth and bruised ribs. The magistrate's shoulders unknotted a fraction as the immediate spectacle resolved into practical salvage. The chronicler kneeled and wrote the outcome. He did not moralize. He wrote bolt tensions, merchant names, the clerk's confession, and the jailer's cut. He made sure to mark the exact time the rope had parted and the names of the men who hauled the cage. He wrote the victim's strained words and the jailer's, because testimony assembled in small, specific fragments proved more than broad claims. They argued whether to arrest Merchant X. The clerk wept and offered testimony that he had been coerced. The magistrate's guards wanted to hush it. Merchant X himself had not yet arrived. A rumor spread that he had bribed for distance and planned to leave town at next tide. The chronicler wrote that rumor and the names connected to it. He kept his quill busy because a ledger that grew precise could not be easily suppressed. At last, beneath a thin rain, the crowd thinned. Men went back to their stalls, some with coins less in hand. The jailer walked away with a smear on his gloves and spoke to no one. The magistrate retreated under his arch and calculated how to smooth over a public stumble. The clerk was taken aside and secured under guard as the courts debated whether the confession would hold. The chronicler closed his ledger, but not before he placed a single marginal note in careful script. Purchased spectacle. Clerk cost, magistrate aware. He set the line with no flourish allowed in a record intended to outlive excuses. He left that note open and visible where guards could read, where the town could see. The ledger stayed on his knee while he waited for the guards to decide whether to seize it. A guard named Rollo approached and asked for the book. "Magistrate wants the record," he said. "You may not take it without town witnesses present," the chronicler replied. Rollo frowned and the magistrate's messenger began to move toward them, but the townspeople who had watched the spectacle then formed, not in agreement, but in a quiet pressure that made force costly. The chronicler used that silence as a tool. He closed the ledger, placed it in his satchel, and said, "This will be entered at council." Let it stand. He did not ask permission. He stated procedure. The jailer paused at the bridge and cleaned his hands on his leather. He did not speak, only ran a thumb along the cut rope and then tossed the severed fiber into the mud. The chronicler watched the motion and wrote. Jailer disposed of rope by river. He documented the small choices that tied men to consequence. When the crowd had thinned to a smattering and the magistrate's guards argued quietly out of earshot, the chronicler rose and closed the ledger with a small, deliberate motion. He had recorded a sequence that shifted blame from anonymous law to named men and merchant interest. He had turned suspicion into a map. He placed the ledger on a stone and wrote one last line, an exact marginal note. This act was a choice, not fate. He underlined it twice. Then he rose and walked away from the bridge while the jailer slouched in the market, and the magistrate called a hurried council. The ledger remained under his arm as he left the river's shore, At noon a thin rain washed iron and stone. The crowd dispersed. Merchant's name would travel from mouth to mouth. The clerk's confession would have to stand in the court next day. The jailer would be recorded as the man who cut the rope. Whether that cut saved or doomed remained for law to say, but for the chronicler the act itself settled moral accounting. He closed his ledger and marked the entry with neat ink. The time, the names, the cut. He left the page open to the marginal note he had added, and then he rose. Guards argued about confiscating his book, but the town's witnesses had seen the ledger and the ink. The chronicler slid the ledger under his arm, its cover smudged with rain and birds' blood, and walked off the bridge while the magistrate's voice called for order behind him. He did not look back more than once. The final image the chronicler recorded before he left was concrete and small. A single rusted shackle tangled in dried rope on damp cobbles near the bridge, rimmed with candlelight from a stall where a seller lit a match. He wrote the object's location, its state, and the fact that no one claimed it. He closed the ledger and with a small, precise stroke added one final marginal line that might indict the town for generations. Spectacle paid for. Record kept. He walked away from the river toward the scriptorium, ledger under arm, and felt the tiredness of a man who had held two truths, law and coin, against each other until one bent. He had translated suspicion into an evidentiary thread. The jailer would answer for the cut. The clerk would stand or fall by confession. The magistrate would rearrange words to keep power. The ledger would not erase the hurt, but it made the choices traceable. At the scriptorium, the chronicler set the ledger on his desk, blew candle, suit from its edge, and wrote a final line in the margin. Let the council choose. Let the record last. He closed the book and left the line open for the next entry. Then he walked out into the day with ink on his fingertips and the weight of a town's decision behind him, a concrete step toward whatever judgment would follow. The chapter ends with him locking his desk and turning a key. Outside, the magistrate's guards argued over seizure, and the jailer crossed the square with stained hands. The ledger stayed under his name and his hand, visible to those who would read it and impossible to unwrite without leaving another mark.